is an Aero C-104, which was built in Czechoslovakia in 1947. It's a license-built version of the Bucker Jungmann, which is the famous name for this airplane. Generically, everybody just calls it a Bucker Jungmann. This one happened to be licensed-built in Czechoslovakia. Built in 1947, they used them for trainers in World War II. It was designed in the 1930s, probably around 1935, I think. Personal biplanes were getting to be a thing in the 30s, especially in Europe, and de Havilland in England really kind of started the trend with their Gypsy Moth, and they sold lots of Gypsy Moths, and so people started to kind of copy the concept of a small biplane with a low-powered engine that was light and reasonable as far as expenses, fuel burn and things. Then a guy named Jean Stamp in Belgium, he was a moth dealer, and he decided he could build a better moth. So he built an airplane called a Stamp, S-T-A-M-P-E, which is sort of similar to this, but was a huge improvement on the Moth, the Gypsy Moth, and was much more maneuverable and aerobatic. And then Karl Bucher in Germany decided he could build a better Stamp, and this is basically the better Stamp, so it's kind of the king of the hill. But yes, about 1935, Bucher came up with this design. They made a two-seater like this one called the Young Man, and a one-seater called the Young Meister, which was kind of the hot rod version, the Young Meister. And they're very sought after because of their flying qualities. I've flown over 130 different types of airplanes, and I always tell everybody this is my favorite type. So I think I'm qualified to say that. But this particular one was built in 1947 in Czechoslovakia. A couple of interesting things about it. In 1959, a Czech pilot defected across the Iron Curtain in this airplane to get away from communism, flew to Germany, I believe, from Czechoslovakia, apparently damaged it on landing. We're not sure how good a pilot he was, but and there's a story going around that he did this at the behest of an American pilot who wanted the airplane in America. It was thought to be the first one in America, although now we've heard a story that there was one right after World War II that an American soldier brought back, kind of a shady deal. So this was either the first or second Jungmann in the United States. The first person in the United States to own it was a guy named Sammy Mason in Santa Paula, California, who was, I think, a Lockheed test pilot and a very well-known aerobatic airshow pilot in the 1960s. And he kept it for about 4 or 5 years, did air shows with it. It originally had I think a Hearth engine, had an inline 4-cylinder engine, was the original engine. And when Sammy Mason brought it back to the States, it had the 4-cylinder inline engine in it. And then it was rebuilt in Texas in, I think, the late 60s. Was it the late, do you know?
63, 4.
Yeah, the middle 60s. In the middle 60s, it was rebuilt in Texas, and the engine from a Beach Traveler was put on it, which is a Lycoming 4-cylinder, American-made, 180 horsepower Lycoming 0360, 360 cubic inches. So you can see the nose contours are a little different than what it would have been in 1947. So that was done, and I think it still flew some air shows back then. And it went through a couple of other owners. Was eventually purchased by a guy in South Carolina who did the rebuild on it in 1999 or 2000, somewhere around in there. He kept it for 17 years and got to the point he was getting older and having a harder time climbing in and out of it, and decided he was going to sell it. And so Dewey and I picked it up in South Carolina and brought it out here to Texas to the new owner. It was 1,241 miles and about 11 and a half hours of flying time. So better than 100 miles an hour, which is pretty good. But as I say, fantastic flying airplane, great for doing loops and rolls and aerobatics with. And we were kind of crammed into it. It's probably made for 170-pound people. And
I was freezing to death. All right.
On Wednesday morning we got up, it was covered with frost. We had to wait up for Thursday morning. We had to wait for a while for the sun to melt the frost on it. But all in all, for the middle of January, it was a good trip to be able to take an open cockpit biplane all the way from South Carolina to Texas in the middle of January. So, cockpits, here's the cockpits. The doors fold down like that to make it easier to get in and out. There's some original stuff in there. Most of the instruments are modern American instruments, but seats and sticks and rudder pedals and all that kind of stuff are original from Czechoslovakia from 1947. The little wooden knob on the left side of the instrument panel is for a tail wheel lock. If you push it forward, it locks the tail wheel to steering, so then you can steer, and if you pull it back as it is now, then it's full swivel, so you can spin it around in tight spaces. Trim is on the right-hand side. There's a big quadrant on the right-hand side with Czechoslovakian writing on it. There it is. You got it down a little bit. That's the trim, pretty sensitive. You don't want to move it too much. If you notice, looking around inside there, the tubes, the structural tubes of the fuselage are small. The airplane is very finely engineered, and everything was calculated to the nth degree to make it as light as possible and still be strong. It's supposed to be stressed to like 11 Gs, and it's amazing. You see these tiny little tubes that make up the fuselage structure. But it's a very popular air show aerobatic airplane. Pop that up. The wings are kind of typical biplane wings, wire braced, kind of a box girder structure. This is one of the unique things. Now again, this was a Stomp innovation, the parallel wires, so that it's a closed loop circuit for both ailerons to move, to have ailerons on all four wings. One of the things, and they're slotted ailerons to make them more effective. But that's a characteristic of Stomps and Buckers that helps make them more maneuverable and aerobatic. See the forward rigged landing gear. The oleos have a very long travel. The shock absorber oleos have a very long travel, so it takes a little bit of getting used to, because the wheels will be touching and rolling on the ground, but you're actually still kind of flying, so you have to kind of get used to that. But that rakish landing gear is part of the Bucker look. And then the front end, you can see the cowling is quite a bit different. Firewall forward, it's very different from what 1947 would have looked like with an inline engine. Now having this flat four Lycoming engine, but a lot more reliable. We flew over about 800 miles worth of trees coming here, so we were happy to have a nice Lycoming engine in front of us. One of the characteristics of the Buckers was these little leather covers over all the outlets. It's just kind of a little, I don't know, kind of a European touch of class, I guess, to cover all where the nuts and bolts and anything that I guess could cause drag, to kind of streamline it a little bit with these little leather covers. So that's a very much a characteristic of the Bucker. I believe that's a stock World War II type PO tube. It's interesting, these little handholds in the bottom of the wing for the ground handling, because they were used for training, and they were used at big military training bases, and probably lots of mechanics on the ground pulling and pushing them around. So they tried to make it easy for them to do that. Normally in the flying wires, they have a separator like that called a javelin, just at the midpoint of the wires to help keep them from vibrating too much. And the man who restored this decided he would put arrows there, which kind of quirky and funny. The emblem on the side, the white horse emblem on the side, is the emblem of a Czech Republic fighter squadron flying MiGs. So it's kind of a modern emblem, but it is from the Czech Republic, from Czechoslovakia. And then the emblems on the tops of the wings are the original World War II Czechoslovakia emblems. A little bitty tail wheel. It's in the full swivel position now. It's swiveled around because we had to push it back in the hangar. And then another interesting thing is these slotted elevators. It's very interesting. You can see if you look underneath, the hinge point of the elevators is very far back from the leading edge, so that as they move up and down, the leading edge moves below the stabilizer and above the stabilizer to catch more air and be more effective. And the rudder's pretty typical. It's got this fancy leather gap seal in it to help make it more effective. Again, kind of a Teutonic or European little detail. So that's pretty much the Bucker Jungmann Aero C-104. Was a trusty steed for us, and a lot of fun. Well, it's a very well-balanced airplane. One of the problems with airplanes in the 1930s is that a lot of them, the ailerons are very heavy, the rudders are very light, elevators are very light. They're not really balanced and coordinated, where the Bucker is very, very balanced and coordinated. And I like to compare it to a Pitts and say that a Pitts is like riding a wild horse. If you know how to ride it well, you can make it do what you want it to do. Where the Bucker is like dancing with the prettiest girl in the room. It's just a very pleasant experience, and kind of exhilarating.